The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace sparkled with crystal chandeliers, casting dancing shadows across the marble floor. Catherine adjusted her emerald green gown one final time before stepping into the room filled with dignitaries, politicians, and members of the royal family. Tonight was the annual Children's Charity Gala, an event she had been planning for months. Her heart swelled with pride knowing that her daughter, Charlotte, would be presenting the evening's main award. Charlotte, now 12 years old, stood near the entrance in her carefully chosen navy blue dress. Her golden hair was perfectly styled, and she clutched her speech cards with nervous excitement. Catherine had spent weeks helping her daughter prepare for this moment. Knowing it would be Charlotte's first major public speaking engagement, the young princess had practiced in front of mirrors, recited her words to her brothers, and even performed for the family's quarters. As guests began to settle into their seats, Catherine noticed Camilla making her entrance. The queen consort wore a stunning burgundy gown that commanded attention from every corner of the room. Her silver hair was elegantly arranged, and she carried herself with the confidence that came from years of royal duties. Catherine smiled warmly and approached her stepmother-in-law, hoping to share her excitement about Charlotte's upcoming presentation. "Camilla, you look absolutely wonderful tonight," Catherine said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "Charlotte is so nervous about her speech. She's been practicing for weeks." Camilla's response was cooler than expected. "As well, public speaking is quite different from practice sessions in one's bedroom," she replied, her tone suggesting something more beneath the surface. "I do hope she's prepared for the reality of addressing such an important audience." Catherine felt a small knot form in her stomach, but pushed the feeling aside. She had always tried to maintain a positive relationship with Camilla, despite the occasional tension that seemed to simmer beneath their interactions. Tonight was about Charlotte and the charity. It's not about any family dynamics that might exist. The evening progressed smoothly through dinner and various speeches from charity representatives. Catherine watched proudly as Charlotte mingled with guests, answering questions about her involvement with the children's charity and discussing her hopes for the future. The young princess displayed grace and maturity beyond her years, making her mother's heart burst with joy as the time approached for Charlotte's presentation. Catherine took her seat in the front row. William squeezed her hand reassuringly, and she could see George and Louis whispering encouragement to their sister from across the room. The atmosphere was perfect, and Catherine felt confident that this would be a night to remember for all the right reasons. The master of ceremonies announced Charlotte's name, and the room erupted in polite applause. Catherine's eyes filled with tears of pride as she watched her daughter walk gracefully to the podium. Charlotte's posture was perfect, her smile radiant, and she carried herself with the poise of someone destined for royal duties. But as Charlotte began to speak, Catherine noticed Camilla shifting uncomfortably in her seat. The queen consort's expression had changed from mild interest to what appeared to be growing irritation. Catherine tried to focus on her daughter's words. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. Charlotte's voice rang clear and confident. As she spoke about the importance of supporting disadvantaged children, her words were heartfelt and genuine, touching the hearts of everyone in the audience. Catherine felt her chest swell with maternal pride, knowing that her months of preparation with Charlotte had paid off beautifully. However, just as Charlotte reached the most important part of her speech, Camilla began to display signs of visible displeasure. She whispered something to the person beside her, shook her head slightly, and made a gesture that Catherine couldn't quite interpret from her position. The subtle movements were enough to catch the attention of nearby guests who began to glance between Charlotte and Camilla with growing curiosity. Catherine's protective instincts kicked in immediately. She could sense that something was building, and every maternal fiber in her being told her to be ready to defend her daughter. The perfect evening she had envisioned was about to take a devastating turn, though she couldn't yet imagine just how public and humiliating the coming moments would be. Charlotte continued her speech with growing confidence, unaware of the tension building in the audience. Her words flowed naturally as she described visiting children's hospitals and meeting young patients who had inspired her to become more involved in charitable work. The audience listened intently, many wiping away tears as she shared stories of brave children facing difficult circumstances. Catherine watched her daughter with immense pride, but her attention kept drifting to Camilla's increasingly agitated behavior. The queen consort had begun tapping her fingers on the table, a gesture that Catherine recognized as a sign of growing impatience. Several photographers had noticed the unusual display and were quietly positioning themselves to capture whatever might happen next. As Charlotte transitioned into discussing the charity's future goals, Camilla suddenly stood up. The movement was so abrupt that it caused a ripple of whispers throughout the ballroom. Catherine's heart began to race as she realized that Camilla was not simply excusing herself for a brief moment. The queen consort's expression had hardened into something Catherine had never seen before. "Excuse me," Camilla said loudly, her voice cutting through Charlotte's speech like a knife. The young princess stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening in confusion and embarrassment. The entire ballroom fell silent, hundreds of eyes turning between the queen consort and the 12-year-old girl at the podium. Catherine rose from her seat instinctively, her maternal instincts screaming at her to protect her daughter. But she was too far away to intervene quickly, and protocol demanded that she not create an even bigger scene. She watched in horror as Camilla took several steps toward the podium, her movements deliberate and commanding. "I think we've heard quite enough about theoretical charity work," Camilla announced, her voice carrying across the silent room. "Perhaps it's time for someone with actual experience to address these important matters." The cruelty in her tone was unmistakable. Charlotte's face flushed bright red, and her hands began to tremble as she clutched her speech cards. The young princess looked desperately toward her mother, seeking guidance on how to handle this unprecedented situation. Catherine could see her daughter's confidence crumbling in real time, and it felt like watching someone destroy a priceless piece of art. William started to stand, but Catherine grabbed his arm, knowing that any reaction from them would only make the situation worse for Charlotte. They had to trust that their daughter would find the strength to handle this moment with grace, even though she was facing something no child should ever have to endure. "I believe," Camilla continued, now addressing the audience directly while Charlotte stood frozen at the podium, "that charity work requires more than simply reading prepared remarks about visits to hospitals. It demands real understanding of sacrifice, commitment, and the wisdom that comes from years of dedicated service." The implied criticism was devastating. Camilla was essentially dismissing Charlotte's efforts as childish play acting, reducing months of genuine charitable work to nothing more than a publicity stunt. The attack was particularly cruel because it struck at Charlotte's sincere desire to make a difference in the world. Catherine felt her face burning with anger and embarrassment. She could see reporters frantically taking notes and photographers, capturing every moment of her daughter's humiliation. Tomorrow's headlines would undoubtedly focus on this confrontation. Charlotte would be forced to relive this moment through endless media coverage. The audience sat in stunned silence, uncertain how to respond to such an unprecedented breach of royal protocol. Some guests looked uncomfortable, while others seemed fascinated by the drama unfolding before them. The charity representatives at the head table appeared mortified, realizing that their important event had been hijacked by family politics. Charlotte, despite her youth, managed to maintain her composure better than many adults might have. She cleared her throat softly and said, "Perhaps Your Majesty would like to share your thoughts with our guests." Her voice wavered slightly, but she had found a way to gracefully step aside while maintaining some dignity. However, Camilla was not finished. She moved closer to the podium, positioning herself in a way that made it clear she was taking control of the situation. "I think our guests would benefit from hearing about real charitable work," she said, her tone suggesting that Charlotte's efforts were anything but real. Catherine felt tears of rage and heartbreak beginning to form in her eyes. She had never imagined that Camilla would publicly humiliate a child, especially her own step-granddaughter, in such a calculated manner. The evening that was supposed to celebrate Charlotte's growing maturity and dedication to service had become a nightmare that would haunt the young princess for years to come. Camilla positioned herself at the podium with the confidence of someone who had done this countless times before. Charlotte, meanwhile, stood awkwardly to the side, her prepared speech cards still clutched in her trembling hands. The young princess looked lost and confused, unsure whether she should return to her seat or remain standing nearby. "Ladies and gentlemen," Camilla began, her voice now warm and commanding as she addressed the audience, "I want to share with you what real charitable commitment looks like." The contrast between her harsh treatment of Charlotte and her gracious demeanor toward the guests was jarring and deliberate. Catherine watched in agony as her daughter became increasingly isolated on the stage. Charlotte's earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a look of devastation that no 12-year-old should have to experience in such a public forum. The young princess kept glancing toward her parents, silently pleading for someone to rescue her from this nightmare, as Camilla launched into her own speech about decades of charitable work. She made several pointed comments that were clearly directed at Charlotte. She spoke about the importance of genuine commitment versus mere appearances, and the difference between real service and photo opportunities. Each barb was designed to diminish Charlotte's efforts while elevating her own contributions. The audience began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. While many respected Camilla's charitable work, the obvious cruelty toward Charlotte was becoming increasingly difficult to watch. Some guests exchanged worried glances, while others stared at their plates, unwilling to witness the young princess's humiliation. Catherine felt her hands clenching into fists beneath the table. Every instinct screamed at her to storm the stage and defend her daughter. But she knew that such a reaction would only create more drama and potentially make things worse for Charlotte. She had to find a way to end the situation without escalating the conflict further. William placed a steadying hand on Catherine's shoulder, but she could feel the tension radiating from him as well. He was struggling with the same protective instincts. Watching his daughter being publicly diminished by someone who should have been supporting her first major charitable endeavor, Charlotte, meanwhile, had found a chair near the edge of the stage and sat down quietly. Her posture spoke volumes about her emotional state, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, hands folded tightly in her lap. The transformation from the confident young woman who had begun the evening to this defeated child was heartbreaking to witness. Camilla continued her speech, seemingly oblivious to the discomfort she was causing throughout the room. She spoke about her own early days in royal life, the challenges she had faced, and the lessons she had learned about true service. While her words were eloquent and her experiences genuine, the context made every sentence feel like another attack. On Charlotte, the photographers in the room were having a field day, capturing every moment of the drama. Catherine knew that these images would be splashed across newspapers and websites within hours, ensuring that Charlotte's humiliation would be preserved and analyzed by millions of people around the world. As the speech dragged on, Catherine began to notice subtle signs of support for Charlotte from unexpected quarters. Several guests were looking at the young princess with obvious sympathy, and she could see some people whispering among themselves with expressions of disapproval. The tide of public opinion was beginning to turn against Camilla's harsh treatment of a child. One of the charity representatives at the head table finally stood up and approached the podium. Catherine held her breath, hoping that someone would finally intervene and restore some dignity to the situation. The representative whispered something to Camilla, presumably reminding her that this was supposed to be Charlotte's moment. Camilla's response was to smile graciously and announce that she would be happy to answer any questions from the audience about her charitable work. The move was calculated to extend her time at the podium while further marginalizing Charlotte, who remained seated quietly at the edge of the stage. Catherine realized that waiting for someone else to rescue her daughter was futile. Despite the potential consequences, she knew she had to act. She stood up slowly, her heart pounding, and began walking toward the stage. Every step felt like a mile, and she could sense hundreds of eyes following her movement. The room fell silent. Once again, as Catherine approached the podium, Camilla's expression shifted from confidence to wariness, as she realized that the confrontation was far from over. Charlotte looked up at her mother with a mixture of hope and anxiety, uncertain whether Catherine's intervention would help or make things worse. "I think," Catherine said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "that we should remember why we're all here tonight." Her tone was respectful but firm, and she maintained eye contact with Camilla as she spoke. "This event is about supporting children in need, and I believe my daughter was doing exactly that with her presentation." The tension in the ballroom was thick enough to cut with a knife as Catherine stood face to face with Camilla at the podium. Every guest in the room understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a direct confrontation between two of the most prominent women in the royal family, played out in front of hundreds of witnesses and countless cameras. Camilla's smile remained fixed, but Catherine could see the steel in her eyes. "Of course, Catherine," she replied smoothly, "though I think it's important for our guests to understand what real charitable commitment involves." The emphasis on real was subtle but unmistakable, another dig at Charlotte's efforts. Catherine felt her composure wavering, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Charlotte has been working with this charity for over a year," she said, her voice steady, despite the anger building inside her. "She's visited hospitals, met with families, and genuinely connected with the children we're here to support tonight." Audience watched this exchange with fascination and growing discomfort. Some guests began pulling out their phones, though whether to record the confrontation or check the time was unclear. The charity representatives looked mortified, realizing that their important fundraising event had been completely derailed by family drama. Charlotte, still seated at the edge of the stage, watched her mother defend her with a mixture of gratitude and mortification. The young princess was mature enough to understand that this public argument, while meant to protect her, was also drawing even more attention to her humiliation. Tears began to form in her eyes as she realized that there was no way to escape this situation gracefully. "I'm sure Charlotte's efforts are well-intentioned," Camilla continued, her tone patronizing. "But perhaps she needs more time to understand the true weight of royal responsibilities. Not everyone is ready for such important work at such a young age." The comment was devastating in its implications. Camilla was essentially saying that Charlotte was too immature and inexperienced to handle the responsibilities she had been given. Coming from the queen consort, these words carried enormous weight and would likely influence how the public viewed Charlotte's future charitable endeavors. Catherine felt something snap inside her, protective fury of a mother watching her child being attacked overwhelmed her usual diplomatic restraint. "Charlotte has shown more genuine compassion and dedication in her 12 years than some people display in decades," she said, her voice rising slightly. "She doesn't need to justify her sincerity to anyone." The room collectively held its breath. Catherine had just delivered a thinly veiled criticism of Camilla's own charitable work, suggesting that Charlotte's efforts were more genuine than those of the queen consort. The accusation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Camilla's mask of civility finally began to crack. "I think," she said icily, "that you're allowing your maternal bias to cloud your judgment about what's appropriate for a child of Charlotte's age. Perhaps it's time for more experienced hands to guide these important initiatives." The suggestion was clear. Camilla was proposing to take over Charlotte's charitable work, effectively removing the young princess from her own projects. The power play was breathtaking in its audacity and cruelty. Catherine realized that this confrontation wasn't just about tonight's speech. It was about control, territory, and the future of Charlotte's role in the royal family. William finally stood up and began walking toward the stage, his face grim with determination. He had remained silent as long as possible, but watching his wife and daughter being publicly attacked had pushed him beyond his breaking point. Several other family members also began to shift in their seats. Sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control, the photographers were in heaven, capturing every moment of the unprecedented royal drama. Catherine knew that these images would dominate headlines for weeks, potentially damaging the entire family's reputation. But in that moment, she didn't care about public relations or diplomatic consequences. Her only concern was protecting her daughter from further humiliation. Charlotte, meanwhile, had risen from her chair and was slowly walking toward the edge of the stage. Her movements were careful and deliberate, as if she were trying to make herself invisible. The young princess had clearly had enough of being the center of this devastating conflict. "I think," Charlotte said quietly, her voice barely audible, but somehow carrying across the silent room, "that I should go now." The simple statement was heartbreaking in its resignation and maturity. The 12-year-old child was trying to remove herself from a situation that the adults around her had failed to handle appropriately. Catherine's heart shattered completely at her daughter's words. She had tried to defend Charlotte, but her intervention had only made things worse. The evening that was supposed to celebrate her daughter's growing maturity and charitable spirit had become a nightmare that would haunt the young princess for years to come. As Charlotte began to walk toward the stage exit, the silence in the room was deafening. Hundreds of guests watched a child retreat from her own charitable event, defeated by the very adults who should have been supporting her. Catherine watched in horror as Charlotte walked slowly toward the stage exit, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The sight of her daughter retreating from her own charitable event was more than any mother could bear. Without thinking about protocol or consequences, Catherine rushed after Charlotte, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor. "Charlotte, wait," Catherine called softly, catching up to her daughter just as she reached the side of the stage. She wrapped her arms around the young princess, feeling Charlotte's small body trembling with a mixture of embarrassment and sadness. "You did nothing wrong, sweetheart. Nothing at all." The embrace was captured by dozens of cameras, creating an image that would become iconic, a mother comforting her humiliated child while the person who had caused that humiliation continued to command the stage. The contrast between Catherine's genuine maternal concern and Camilla's cold calculation was stark and unmistakable. William reached them moments later, his face dark with controlled anger. He placed a protective hand on Charlotte's shoulder and spoke quietly to both his wife and daughter. "Let's go," he said simply. "We don't need to stay here and endure this." The decision to leave was unprecedented. Never before had senior members of the royal family walked out of a charitable event, especially one they had organized. But William's protective instincts as a father had overridden his sense of royal duty. He was determined to remove his family from this toxic situation. As the three of them prepared to leave, Camilla's voice rang out from the podium. "I hope everyone understands that sometimes difficult decisions must be made in the best interests of the institution," she announced to the remaining guests. "Growing up in the royal family requires learning when to step back and allow more experienced voices to guide important work." The comment was a final insult, suggesting that Charlotte's departure was somehow her own fault, rather than the result of Camilla's cruel treatment. Catherine felt her anger reach a boiling point, but she forced herself to focus on Charlotte rather than responding to the provocation. The walk to the ballroom exit felt like the longest journey of Catherine's life. She could feel hundreds of eyes following their movements, and she knew that their departure would be the lead story in tomorrow's newspapers. But all that mattered was getting Charlotte away from this nightmare and helping her daughter understand that she had done nothing to deserve such treatment. As they reached the exit, several guests approached them with expressions of sympathy and support. Lady Morrison, a longtime family friend, squeezed Catherine's hand and whispered that was absolutely appalling. Charlotte handled herself beautifully. Similar comments came from other guests, making it clear that public opinion was solidly behind the young princess. In the car ride home, Charlotte finally broke down completely. The tears she had been holding back throughout the evening poured out in great, gulping sobs that broke Catherine's heart all over again. "I worked so hard on that speech, Mummy," she cried. "I really wanted to help those children." Catherine held her daughter close, stroking her hair and murmuring reassurances. "You did help them, darling. The speech was beautiful, and everyone who heard it understood how much you care." She couldn't bring herself to mention that most people would remember the confrontation rather than Charlotte's words. William drove in grim silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Catherine knew he was struggling with his own anger and disappointment, feeling like he had failed to protect his daughter from this humiliation. The entire family had been blindsided by Camilla's unprecedented attack on a child. When they arrived home, George and Louis were waiting in the living room, having watched the events live stream on television. Both boys looked confused and upset, not fully understanding what had happened, but knowing their sister had been hurt. George, at 15, was old enough to grasp the political implications of what had occurred. Why did she do that to Charlotte? George asked his parents, his voice filled with confusion and anger. Charlotte was just trying to help kids in hospitals. Catherine and William exchanged glances, both struggling to explain something that made no sense to them either. "How could you?" They help their children understand that sometimes adults behave badly, even when they're supposed to be setting an example. The evening news was already running footage of the confrontation, with commentators analyzing every word and gesture. Catherine turned off the television, not wanting Charlotte to see herself being discussed and dissected by strangers. The young princess had been through enough trauma for one night. As Catherine tucked Charlotte into bed, her daughter asked quietly, "Do you think I'm too young for charity work?" Maybe Camilla was right. The question revealed how deeply the evening's events had shaken Charlotte's confidence in herself and her abilities. "Absolutely not," Catherine said firmly. Age doesn't determine the size of your heart or your ability to care about others. What happened tonight wasn't about your capabilities. It was about someone else's insecurities and poor judgment. But even as she spoke these reassuring words, Catherine knew that the damage had been done. Charlotte's first major public appearance had been ruined, and the young princess would likely carry the scars of this humiliation for years to come. The evening that was supposed to launch Charlotte's charitable career had instead become a cautionary tale about the cruel realities of royal life. The next morning brought a flood of newspaper headlines and social media commentary that made Catherine's heart sink even further. "Royal family torn apart at charity gala," screamed one tabloid, while another proclaimed Camilla puts young Charlotte in her place. The coverage was exactly what Catherine had feared: sensationalized, dramatic, and focused entirely on the conflict rather than the charitable cause. Catherine sat in her private study, scrolling through endless articles and opinion pieces about the previous evening. Some supported Charlotte and criticized Camilla's behavior, while others suggested that the young princess had been given responsibilities beyond her years. The division of public opinion was creating exactly the kind of controversy that this royal family worked so hard to avoid. What hurt most were the articles that questioned Charlotte's sincerity, suggested that her charitable work was nothing more than publicity stunts. These pieces echoed Camilla's implications from the night before, and Catherine knew that Charlotte would eventually read these cruel assessments of her genuine efforts to help others. William entered the study, looking haggard and angry. He had spent the early morning in emergency meetings with palace staff, trying to develop a strategy for managing the media fallout. "The palace wants to issue a statement saying it was a misunderstanding," he said grimly. "They want to smooth things over and pretend nothing happened." Catherine felt her anger flare again. A misunderstanding? Our daughter was publicly humiliated by someone who should have been supporting her. That's not a misunderstanding. That's calculated cruelty. She couldn't believe that the palace's first instinct was to protect Camilla rather than acknowledge the harm that had been done to Charlotte. The morning brought several phone calls, from family members and friends expressing their support and outrage. Catherine's mother called early, her voice shaking with anger as she described watching the events unfold on television. "I've never seen anything so unnecessary and cruel," she said. "That poor child didn't deserve any of that." Charlotte herself remained in bed longer than usual, clearly reluctant to face the day and the inevitable questions about the previous evening. When she finally came downstairs for breakfast, she looked pale and subdued. Nothing like the confident young woman who had started the gala just hours before. "Are people writing mean things about me?" Charlotte asked quietly, picking at her. Breakfast without appetite. She had grown up understanding that royal life involved media attention, but this was her first experience with truly negative coverage. Catherine chose her words carefully. "Some people don't understand what really happened last night, sweetheart. But many people are supporting you and recognizing how hard you've worked for this charity." She didn't mention the harsher criticisms, hoping to protect Charlotte from the worst of the commentary. As the day progressed, something unexpected began to happen. The charity that had been the focus of the gala started receiving an unprecedented number of donations and messages of support. People who had watched the events unfold were making contributions specifically in Charlotte's name, expressing their admiration for her grace under pressure. The charity's director called Catherine personally to share the news. "We've received more donations in the past 12 hours than we typically see in a month," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "People are saying they want to support Charlotte's work and show that they believe in her mission." This outpouring of support provided the first bright spot in an otherwise devastating situation. Catherine realized that while Camilla's attack had been cruel and unnecessary, it had also revealed Charlotte's genuine character to the world. The young princess's grace and maturity in the face of such treatment had impressed people far more than any prepared speech could have. When Catherine shared this news with Charlotte, she saw the first genuine smile her daughter had shown since the previous evening. "Really?" Charlotte asked, her eyes brightening. "People actually want to help the children because of what happened. They want to help because they see your heart," Catherine explained. "They recognize that you truly care about making a difference, and they want to be part of that." The afternoon brought another unexpected development. Several other members of the royal family, including some who rarely spoke out on family matters, issued statements supporting Charlotte's charitable work. The Queen herself sent a private message praising Charlotte's dedication and maturity, making it clear that the young princess had the full support of the monarch. As the family gathered for dinner that evening, Catherine looked around the table. At her husband and children, the events of the previous night had been traumatic, but they had also revealed important truths about character, resilience, and the power of genuine compassion to inspire others. Charlotte seemed more like herself. Again, discussing plans for her next charity visit and expressing determination to continue her work despite the setback. "I won't let what happened stop me from helping children," she said with quiet resolve. "If anything, I want to work even harder now." Catherine felt her heart swell with pride and love. Her daughter had faced her first major public humiliation with remarkable grace and emerged stronger rather than broken. The evening that had begun as Catherine's worst nightmare as a mother had ultimately revealed the depth of Charlotte's character and the strength of their family bond. That night, as Catherine kissed Charlotte goodnight, her daughter asked one final question. "Mummy, do you think I'll ever understand why she did that to me?" Catherine considered her answer carefully. "I don't know if we'll ever fully understand it, darling. But I know that how she treated you says nothing about who you are and everything about who she is. Your response to cruelty is what defines your character, and you showed everyone exactly who you are." As Catherine turned off the lights and closed Charlotte's door, she reflected on the truth of those words. The evening had indeed shattered her heart, but it had also revealed the unbreakable spirit of her remarkable daughter.